And the last lesson here that I think that we can learn from my mom's life is that for a long time she lived her life alone, but she was never really alone. And she wasn't alone because I was around or because you were around or because she had great people to work with at the office. You see, she latched on to a verse in the Old Testament, a little phrase that goes something like this: your maker will be your husband. And that became the defining point of her relationship, a real relationship with God. You see, that was the source of who she was. And she walked in that relationship like many of us walk in our marriage relationships, in communication, spending time together, not just talking, but listening, and wanting to know that other person deeply and intimately and passionately, and knowing the dreams that were on the heart of God for her life and for others. And that was real for her. As Marty mentioned earlier, we've been flipping through her Bible a little bit over the last week or so, and it's been interesting to see the verses that she's underlined or highlighted or made notes in the margin, because there are dates next to different verses and different promises throughout the book. I'll give you an example of one that just shows this connection that she had. The date was February of 2009. It was right before she went in for chemo and for the transplant last month. And she was looking back at all that she'd been brought through the first time and looking ahead at everything that was in front of her. And the verse said this: unless the Lord had helped me, I would soon have died. I cried out, I'm slipping, and your unfailing love, Lord, supported me. When doubts filled my mind, your comfort gave me renewed hope and cheer. You see, when she read words like that, she believed that though it was written thousands, hundreds of million, trillion years ago, that those verses were written for her at that moment in her life, as though that was a direct note from God. Unless the Lord had helped me, I would soon have died. I cried out, I'm slipping, and your unfailing love, O Lord, supported me. When doubts filled my mind, your comfort gave me renewed hope and cheer. Now, this is really difficult for me to describe. I'd like this for myself, but it's hard to understand. It's hard to get a grasp on having a relationship with something that you can't see. But again, at the hospital, I think back to that Friday, or last Friday, before she passed away. If you remember, that was kind of the end of the good. On the Tuesday afternoon, she started making some real progress. Her numbers were improving. She had about 3 really good days in a row, and the doctors were starting to be a little bit more hopeful. They were starting to talk about different procedures that she might be able to do in the coming week. Some of the nurses even talking about bringing her out of sedation and waking her up, be able to talk to her again. So I remember going to school that morning, that Friday morning, and my routine was to get up, call the nurses at 6:30, who had been there since 7 the night before, kind of get an update on how the night had gone. At 6:30, things were okay. Around 4 or 5 in the morning, she kind of had a little dip in some of her numbers, but overall still looking pretty good. So I went to school and called in again during my open hour, about 11:30, and got a little bit of a different report at that time. She numbers continued to drop, and things started to take that turn for the worse over the last couple of days. Really started on that Friday morning. Now I'm putting in a full day of school here because I'm a trooper. And I'm thinking to myself, the one thing that I've got to make sure that I do is I've got to get to the hospital before the doctor leaves. Because the schedule is the doctors get together in teams of like 40, and they walk around from room to room, and they discuss the situation, they look at the updates of the numbers and the labs and her condition, and they make a game plan for the next day. And then they sort of scatter. Once they're done with all of their rounds, they scatter. And sometimes they're hard to find. Well, what was even more worrisome for me on that Friday was that because of the way the shifts were changing at the hospital, the doctor that we had interacted with over the last 2 weeks was going to be moving. She was going to be transferred to a different part of the hospital in the next week. So this was kind of my last shot to talk to her about what she thought was going to happen and get, as much information from the doctor that knew the most about the situation before she moved on. So at any rate, 3:30 rolls around. I did consider leaving 22 seventh graders to themselves at 3 o'clock, but didn't. I know my boss is here. I didn't, regardless of what you've heard. They were that way even when I was in the room, okay? And 3:30 rolls around, jump in the car, drive straight up, take Kirk Ferentz's parking spot at Kinnick, run across the street, up through the labyrinth of hallways to my mother's room, and run into the nurse. I apologize for knocking her over. Put my gown on and the gloves and wash up as you're supposed to go into her room. And I remember standing at the door at 4:30, knowing that the doctors were probably going to leave around 5 or 5:30. And I knew where their office was. Their little conference room was off to the side, and our room was kind of over here. So it was a bit of an awkward angle. It wasn't a natural angle to be seen. But I remember my perspective was this. I'm going to be in this doorway, and I'm going to be visible. And if that doctor comes through that hallway or out of that office, I'm going to make sure that she sees me before she leaves. Oh, I wanted to go stand next to my mom and, sit in the corner maybe and send an update or something like that. Kind of wanted to use the restroom, actually. But there was nothing that was going to keep me from talking to that doctor on that day because she had all the information. You see, you can get stuff from the nurses, but when you talk to the doctor, that's the person that's making the call. That's the person that's putting the plan together. And I did not want to miss seeing her the last time that she was going to be there. So I'm standing out there and getting in everybody's way and waiting, and any, glimpse of a white coat that moved, I'm ready to pounce. Well, eventually the doctor came back and we talked about where she was and what the plan would be for the weekend. And as I went back and sat down, I thought, you know what? Standing at that door and waiting for that doctor is pretty similar to the way my mom lived her life with Christ. See, I had the privilege of living with my mom for about 5 summers when I was in college. We'd come back and work at Fleming's and dig holes in the ground. Really appreciate the hookup with the cushy job there. And we would work, some longer days than what she would in the office. And so we would come home. I'd come home at, 5:30 or 6 or whatever at night. And my mom would have been home for a couple of hours by then. And every time I came home, she was always sitting in the same place. She's sitting in her rocker in the corner, feet up on the footstool, big, massive Bible out on her lap, just reading. Just reading. Large print Bible, probably weighed 100 pounds, probably made more than she did. And as the night would go on and I'd clean up and find some dinner and come back around, she didn't really move. I mean, she was reading that Bible to find one of those verses that would speak to her for that night. With the same urgency and the same desire that I had to speak with that doctor is exactly how she approached hearing from God and reading her Bible on a daily basis. And she would sit there and sit there and sit there until she got something. And if the night went on and her eyes started to be squinty, she'd put the Bible down and she'd turn on the computer and she'd put the font so there was like 3 words per screen and just scroll, for on and on until she got something that was going to get her through the next day. So even though she lived alone for a long time, see, she was never really alone.